Are you looking for the best ergonomic knitting needles? Are you wondering if all of these weirdly shaped knitting needles by Prim, Adi or Knitter's Pride are truly worth it? Do they really help if you have arthritis or pain in your fingers or wrists? Well, according to the subscribers on my Patreon account, they really do. So in this video, I want to take a close look at all of the most popular ergonomic knitting needles, knit some swatches together with you, and then compare everything close up. So let's dive right into it. Ergonomic knitting needles is a wide field, and most big needle manufacturers do offer some products that can be easy on your hands. However, in this video I'm going to limit myself to products that are readily available and are specifically marketed as ergonomic. Here are my choices. So here we have some Adi needles. These are called a novel. They are, maybe you can see a little better here, they are square and have these interesting ridges in between. They are available as fixed circulars and interchangeable tips. Then we have the Knitter's Pride Cubics. They are available in laminated birchwood or coated metal. And last but not least, we have the Prim knitting needles. They are, unlike all the other needles, they are triangular and they have steel cables, and those are only available as fixed circulars or, of course, double-pointed knitting needles. Before we take a closer look, let's talk about the basic idea behind ergonomic knitting needles. Why are these needles not round but square or triangular? Well, a typical knit stitch is round. It's a loop, and unless you knit with metal wire, it will never be anything but round. See, it's just a loop of yarn. The yarn will always take the path of least tension or resistance, even if you knit with square needles. So here on the needles, this is square. And as soon as I remove the needle here, nice little round loops. So from the point of fabric construction, a round needle is the most efficient. There is one problem, the point of contact. Your fingers, they are not concave, they are round. So this means all the force you apply to your knitting needle will be focused on one point. So, of course, your fingers will sort of nestle into the needles with force, but that is actually a somewhat unnatural state for them, and even then the full force will still be focused on one point. And this will eventually lead to calluses here along the palm of your hands, or here, or this is also a very popular spot for calluses, and that is never a good sign. And if you already suffer from arthritis and other such ailments, the pain will set in even quicker. Enter square needles. The area of contact is much larger, and so you have a much bigger surface, and this will distribute the force you apply more evenly. And the smaller your needle size, the more pronounced this effect will be. If you have a 10 millimeter round needle, there's going to be a surface of around 3 to 4 millimeters that is going to be near flat anyway. But with smaller needles, the full force will be focused on a small space that is less than 1 millimeter, while of course the size of your fingers always stays the same. Another factor is, of course, warmth. Metal has a much higher heat conductivity than, say, wood or plastic. And that is the very reason why aluminium, as they use for these double-pointed knitting needles here, is used. It's the same material. It's used for passive coolers in computers or so. So if your hands are always cold, picking a material that doesn't wick away all the heat is always a good choice on top of that. Because, I mean, any sportsman spokesman or woman will tell you cold muscles and tendons are much more likely to get injured. Another factor we need to look at is weight. So this set of double-pointed knitting needles is 21 grams. And holding your project and your needle takes strength. And the heavier the whole contraption is, the more stress you put on your joints, tendons, and muscles. And this is of course something you want to avoid, and the very reason why, for example, Prem produces their double-pointed knitting needles using, well, what they call carbon technology. And the same set of double-pointed knitting needles, same size, same length, is only 5 grams. So that is definitely another factor you need to look out when it comes to ergonomic knitting needles. If you want to learn more about ergonomic knitting in general, I recommend watching my full video on preventing knitting pain. I'll link it to you up in here. We'll take a closer look at the actual needles now. Let's start with the Prem ergonomic needles first. As you can see, they come in this nice little cardboard box, and as you pull them out, you can see that these fixed circulars look decidedly different. These are not your average knitting needles. First of all, they are not totally round. So this middle portion here, from here to here, is triangular with these little grip patches in the middle. They are only here on this side. The other side is white. The next thing you might notice are those teardrop shaped tips here. Prem calls them hook tips, and they are meant to make it easier to pull a stitch through. Here are the tips close up. So this is probably not the best tip for complicated lace patterns with many decreases, increases, and cables. But I can well imagine that they might be a good choice for any knitter that tends to push the tips a lot, has problems with purling, and prefers simpler projects. Here, this is the very end. The transition here towards the cable is also very, very smooth. You probably already noticed these steel cords. Of course, they don't have a memory effect, so it just stays flat or straight no matter what you do with them, and you don't end up with a curly mess as you knit with them. These cords here are surprisingly thin and surprisingly flexible, so super malleable, to a point where I would say you could even use them for a traveling magic loop. So quite nice. And if you always thought that standard ChiaoGoo twist cables are a little bit too stiff for your tastes, then you are in for a surprise. The needles themselves are plastic, so they call it high performance synthetic material. I mean, whatever that means, but you will notice that they are quite durable, but also a little bit flexible. And you also might have wondered, well, why is this part here in a different color? Well, this is yet a different material, and you can see that here this is even more flexible, almost like rubber, I guess. One little side note here, you might see that the small size, so 2.5 millimeter, is also available in this, well, black grayish color. And these are the very same needles, but they call it carbon technology. So it seems to be the very same high performance synthetic material, but it says with carbon fibers. So I mean, I guess 2.5 millimeter needles are very prone to breaking, so they had to add a little extra durability here. Other than that, there really is no difference. So it's the same tip, the same kind of flexibility, and the same triangular shape here in the middle with these, well, little grips here on one side. Anyway, those were the close-ups. Let's knit a couple of stitches together. So I have a little swatch, coaster really here, and let's knit a couple of stitches together. So when you first see those tips, I mean, these needles almost look like a little drumstick or so. You might think it's rather difficult to knit with them, but actually the opposite is true. It's almost impossible to split the yarn. I mean, this is a DK 6-ply yarn, so it's actually rather easy to split it, and it doesn't happen, and it's actually very smooth knitting. You kind of have to push the needle through a tiny little bit more force, but the rest of the knitting, especially pulling the yarn through, is actually easier, because here this little drop keeps the stitch from slipping off. You know, this can often happen, and the drop kind of prevents this. What you will certainly also notice is that these needles have quite a high friction, so there's a lot of drag, so it's more like knitting with bamboo needles. I mean, it glides across rather effortlessly, because here this middle section is actually narrower than the rest, so you can push it across quite easily, but still here this front portion of the needle, it's rather slow, and here the end, I mean, this is flexible, so as you push stitches across, so what often happens is that the stitches do get caught. Now, I mean, you know, not like in a horrible way, like when your interchangeable knitting needles unscrew, but still, if you were to knit magic loop, I think this could be somewhat annoying. Now let's turn around and purl a couple of stitches. So, here, this is my garter stitch selvage. I really feel that these teardrop shaped tips really make purling a lot easier. So normally, as you can see, I purl like this with the help of my middle finger. But with these needles, you can definitely do it without very easily, because, well, the tip acts a bit like a hook. Of course, a lot of people purl exactly like this anyway, but due to the hook, you need to flex your wrists less, and that is always a bonus when we are talking about ergonomic knitting. So I feel this works like a charm. Now here are my issues with these needles. First, as you turn them around, see this grip here is on the back side. Now I'm not even sure if this portion does something. It kind of feels the same. But even if it wasn't, because of the triangular shape, you would have to twist it around slightly anyway, because a triangle will always have a vertex on the other side of the edge. Now, according to the website, this middle portion is only narrower because it allows stitches to glide across a little bit easier. Fair enough. But here's what happens for me. So I hold my thumb here, and it happens to be right where the triangular part starts. So instead of hitting the flat part, which would be ideal, or touching it up here, which would be normal, my thumb kind of clicks into this dent. And this hyperflexes my thumb slightly, something you, or rather I absolutely want to avoid. Your thumb should be like this, maybe like this, but not like this. And the last thing I noticed, my gauge is totally off. So I'm a tight knitter and always have been. And this fabric here is super loose. I mean, this is 4.5 millimeters. And I think I would have to go down 1 or maybe even 2 needle sizes to 3.5 millimeters to produce a fabric that isn't just holes. Now there's one important thing I need to address. I showed you these 4.5 millimeter needles for a reason. So as you go up to say 7 or 8 millimeters, then this drumstick shape is getting more and more extreme. I mean, this really looks like a drumstick with a little dent here, and you are gonna notice this while knitting. And then as you go down, they turn into almost a different kind of needle, because here you can clearly see that this flexible end part is missing, and here you get wire cables as well for the 4.0 millimeters, but it's suddenly coated, and then this triangular shape or portion in the middle is suddenly missing. And then as you go down even further to 3 millimeters, then suddenly these grippers are missing as well, and you only get these little stripes. So you definitely should be aware that these needles look decidedly different the further down or up you go. All in all, I would say these Prym ergonomic knitting needles could be perfect for beginners. The tips facilitate knitting and especially purling. The high flexibility is perfect for those beginners that hold their needles in a death grip, and they have a nice friction so stitches don't fall off too easily while the wire cables don't curl. Whether these needles are in fact ergonomic, well, I'm a little bit hesitant to pass judgment on them. They are certainly super light. They literally weigh nothing and warm to the touch, which is always a bonus for those with joint and muscle problems. But due to the position of this triangular part, they don't work for me. So I end up hyperflexing my thumb, and here this edge actually pushes into my fingers quite uncomfortably. But this is not to say they can't work for you. Depending on how you hold your needles and grip them, I can well imagine that these could work quite splendidly. And please keep in mind that I don't experience any pain while knitting. I don't have arthritis or so. And often when these things happen, or when you notice these kind of pains and problems and illnesses, you will have to do some unlearning anyway. So most people can't just go on knitting the way they used to. So what you could do is you could order just one pair and then see if you can make things work or you can't. But here are some other options for you. Next, I want to take a closer look at the Knitter's Pride Cubics. Knitter's Pride is marketed as Knit Pro in Europe, but they are the exact same thing. Unlike the Prym needles, these needles are, as you can see, square. Square means, of course, that the surface area is a little bit smaller compared to a triangle, at least on each side. But it also means they are closer to a fast and efficient circle. And you might also notice that the full body of the needle is square and not just a portion in the middle, but it starts right here at the taper and goes all the way here towards the connection where you attach the cables. The tips of these ergonomic needles are much sharper, as you can see. So this here is basically a standard Knitter's Pride tip. So not a totally stiletto sharp tip, but definitely suitable for more advanced patterns. As can be expected, the birchwood alternative is a little bit blunter. In both cases, the taper is rather short. So here are some ChiaoGoo needles for comparison, where the taper is probably 5 millimeters or so longer. So these needles here could be a good choice for tighter knitters. Here at the very end you have a nice and neat transition towards the connection. The wooden cubic needles by Knitter's Pride do have a noticeable step here, especially around the edges. I mean, you can see that they try to smoothen things out a little bit, but still there is a tiny little step. I wonder why they did it like this. There must be a reason. If you connect the tips to a cable, you end up with a reasonably smooth transition here. It's not utterly unnoticeable, especially here for the metal needles. If you glide across with your fingertip, you definitely notice a step here. You, well, almost don't. So it's nothing that will catch the yarn, but it's still a little bit noticeable. One thing I definitely want to highlight is that these tips are interchangeable with all the other products Knitter's Pride has on the market, and they have the biggest product catalog. So you could attach these cubic needles to the standard Nova Platina cables. You could use the a little bit more flexible and thinner cables that come with the Carbons needles, and you can also use the coated wire cables that come with the Mindful collection. So depending on your preferences and your project, you could use different cables. And when we're talking about knitting ergonomics or ergonomic knitting needles, I think this really matters, because we all knit a little bit differently. We all have different bodies, and here you really get to choose which accessories you want to use, whereas all the other brands basically say, well, here's our cable, use this. All in all, the wooden needles are quite a bit lighter, so only 3 grams instead of 8 grams, so quite a big difference. And they are of course much warmer, but they will be slower to knit. Then again, I would say that those people looking for ergonomic knitting needles are not all that concerned about speed to begin with. Let's knit a couple of stitches together. So let's knit across a couple of stitches. And I'll share my impressions as I go along. So one thing I noticed right away is that the taper is a little bit too short for my personal liking. Another thing I noticed is I typically keep my tips rather close together. So as I knit, I constantly collide with one of the edges. So that's something I noticed, because here I would probably expect the taper to be a little bit longer, and if it was longer that wouldn't happen, but I'm not knitting here. But probably when we're talking about knitting ergonomics, it's probably better to knit much closer to the tips than I usually do. So there's that. Another thing that I noticed I do notice the edges of the needles here pushing against my fingers. So I would assume it takes a little bit of getting used to holding the needles correctly so that all the sides align with my fingers. Here on this side, this is 4 millimeters. I barely notice a difference, probably because the square shape is cushioned by the actual stitches on the needles. But otherwise, I would say this is pretty smooth knitting, so just like a standard hardwood needle. In terms of slidability here, this is okay. So just like before, well, the yarn doesn't catch as much, but still a little bit. So compared to the Prym needles, I would say this is a little bit better. I quickly switched to the metal needles to show you that as well. So I immediately notice that I don't feel the edges as much. So here, these edges for the wood needles, I actually would say they feel somewhat sharpish, if that makes sense. And here the edges of the square are a little bit more well-rounded, so I actually like this. Of course, the metal needles are much faster, and I don't know, I don't seem to have the problems with the taper. So let's turn this around and see how purling goes. Well, after I dealt with my selvage stitch here. So same, I mean, of course, metal needles are also always a little bit noisier, so you can definitely hear a little clicking sound. But in terms of knitting smoothness and actual comfort in my hands, mind you, in my hands, I would say the metal needles have the better tips that allow for more efficient knitting, and they rest a little bit more comfortable in my hands. So what's my final verdict? These wooden cubic needles, I think I personally would give them a pass. So first of all, the taper is a little bit shorter, maybe just 1 or 2 millimeters, but that is giving me problems. It's just too short and also a little bit too blunt. And here, when I grip these needles, it just feels all edges, even though my thumb here is rather straight, as opposed to here where it's a little bit more on the hyperflexed side. Not totally, but you can see it's a little bit bent, but still this is the same needle size, both 4 millimeters, and this feels more comfortable, at least to me. When it comes to these metal needles, I actually think they are fairly nice. They don't have these sharp edges, so they rest rather comfortably in my hand, and here my thumb is nice and straight as well. And the tips are a little bit sharper, the taper long enough for most purposes, and I think they are nice. Some people probably won't like the transition here. It is sometimes, I noticed, a little bit on the rougher side, depending on the cable or a needle you get. Sometimes it's really nice and sometimes there's a noticeable step. So that's probably, if quality control is watching, maybe check this out. But otherwise, this feels like a very sensible product. The last ergonomic knitting needles I want to take a look at are these Adi Novelle needles. These are also square in shape, but they have these little ridges in between. Can you see this? So I think, or I read that the idea behind it, that it's supposed to massage your hands a little bit as you hold them. Well, I am not so sure about that. However, if we do go back to our little theory session here where I said, well, our fingers are not concave, well, these needles actually make sense in this context, because one could argue that our fingers perfectly fit into this little, well, concave mold, stands, or however you want to call them, and it might actually be an even better fit for your fingers than just a flat surface. It certainly feels that way. You will also notice that these needles are, despite being metal, they are super light. And they are actually around 2 or 1.5 grams lighter than the Nova Cubics, despite being longer. So that is certainly a nice bonus. And these needles are also coated white bronze, in case you were interested, so no nickel included in either of these needles. So this means they also allow for very speedy knitting. Another thing you will instantly notice is that these needles have a very long taper, nice and sharp compared to the cubics, well, almost twice as long. So these are definitely lace tips. I mean, you know, not as sharp here by comparison, not as sharp as the higher tips, but definitely nice and sharp. For me personally, that's always something I am looking for. Long taper, sharp tip, and of course coated. Here on the other side you have the regular Adi click system, and I need to use grippers here because it's rather warm today. So people familiar with this system will know that you don't end up with screws, but of course there is a noticeable step here on this side. However, this transition here is nice and smooth. The fixed circulars, of course, don't have this step, so if you are worried about that or you simply don't like the Addi click system, then this could be a nice option. Another thing I noticed that sets apart the interchangeable tips from the fixed circulars, and this is probably very hard to capture on camera, but the fixed circulars are actually a little bit smoother and more polished, and it's definitely something you will notice while knitting. So these here have a little bit more friction than the fixed circulars here below. So for speed knitters or people who want to go as fast as possible, this could be well, a deciding factor. So let's knit across here. What I instantly notice is that these needles are, well, they don't feel as coated metal, more like aluminium or stainless steel. So there's a notable friction to them and a noticeable kind of, well, microscopic grinding thing. It's something I notice. Other than that, they rest very comfortably in my hand. These tips are very nice, something I really appreciate, and just so sharp, nice taper. So I feel it's a joy to knit with them. Again, they rest rather nicely in my hands. However, the slight, well, friction resistance is somewhat, well, I'm a very sensitive knitter, so it's definitely something I notice and something I don't notice with these fixed circulars. So keep that in mind. But as you can see, very nice and efficient knitting. Just love that. And just because we did it with all the other swatches, so what you definitely notice here, it actually catches the yarn, so you have to kind of maneuver them across. So this almost always happens, so the yarn catches this little step, something that obviously wouldn't happen here if you use the fixed circulars. Do keep that in mind. But of course, the same thing also often happens when you're using swivel cables and things like that. So I think it's a matter of getting used to that, but I know that a lot of people find that annoying. So what would be my final verdict? I would say these rest quite comfortably in my hand. I'm not sure about the massaging thing. I'm well, not sure. But what it does, I guess, is it allows for dynamic knitting. So you don't always apply the same kind of pressure to your fingers across, knitting 2 hours or so. These ridges mean that different areas of your fingers experience different kind of pressure, sometimes a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less, depending on how you hit these ridges. And I think this could be something very positive. Same when you sit in the same posture for 2 hours, dynamic sitting is typically the better idea. Now, my personal preference would go towards these fixed circulars, not necessarily because of the little step here. I personally don't mind that, never have, but these are slicker and I just feel that that's nicer. Other than that, very nice tip, very long taper, slick knitting, very nice. So what would be my final verdict? What's my opinion? What are the best ergonomic knitting needles for me? Well, if I personally would have to pick a favorite, then it probably would be these Knitter's Pride Nova Cubics. I love how comfortably they rest in my hands. The taper is maybe a tiny fraction too short, but I can definitely make this work. The fixed circulars by Addi would be a close second. So I love the luxuriously long and sharp tips, but sometimes I kind of hit the ridges here on the needles a little bit, well, in a weird way, and that kind of feels irritating. So, but they are certainly also a very nice needle, and one that I sometimes even knit with. Same the Cubics. When it comes to where are they, these Prym needles, well, I'm not really sure if they truly are more ergonomic, at least not for me. They kind of have the feel of, well, I don't think they bring more to the table than a standard hardwood needle, at least not in that department. But I would say these could be a very, very nice beginner needle. And of course, whenever you knit with yarn that splits very easily, these can also be very, very nice. As I said before, these Knitter's Pride Cubics Symphony, or in hardwood or birchwood, well, these are kind of a hard pass for me. I don't like the way they feel in my hands. And these interchangeable Adi Novel tips, they are not my favorite as well. So for me, maybe I bought a wrong batch, I don't know. They feel a tiny bit too slow in my hands, and of course a lot of people might not like this step towards the cables. We also need to talk about swatches, because a lot of people and companies actually recommend going up or down. You find both informations, go up or down in needle size when it comes to these ergonomic knitting needles. So I've knitted this swatch using this mustard yellow color and these 4mm round Knitter's Pride Symphony needles. And here, where is it? Here is the swatch I've knitted with the Knitter's Pride Cubic needles. So let's align these and stack them upon each other. And as you can see, well, I would say there's maybe half a stitch of a difference. Both swatches are of course unblocked, because if I were to block them, I might stretch this swatch a little bit more than this, and it would lead me to all the wrong conclusions. Then here is the swatch I've knitted with the Adi Novel needles. Let's stack them upon each other as well. So difficult here. So probably this is a full stitch of a difference, a full stitch here, but still, you know, not so much that I would actually go down in needle size. This is just the standard difference between various needles, like wooden needles, metal needles. You always notice a slight difference in gauge. So whenever you can't get gauge, it's always good to remember that you can switch needle materials. Anyway, here is a swatch I've knitted with the 4mm Prym needles. Let's put it on top of each other. And there is, as far as I can tell, no difference. Let's do it the other way around. Maybe it's smaller or so. No, same size, but of course that is to be expected, because here these 4mm needles aren't triangular in the middle, whereas the 4mm needles are, and that's why here, and that's probably something you will notice. I would have to knit 4 more swatches, and I'm a little bit lazy, but here you probably will notice for the 4.5mm needles and above that there will be, well, at least for me, they turn out decidedly looser. At the end of the day, I want you to know 3 things. First of all, I don't have arthritis, and when I knit, I don't experience any pain in my wrists or fingers. So there is no problem to fix for me. So at the end of the day, all I can do is I can show you the needles here in the video, and you have to take it from there. Secondly, if you have problems, I actually recommend buying a single pair from all of these brands. If you live in the US, you might even try to find some of the Collage square needles. They are not available here in Europe, so I never bought them and I never knitted with them. But that is another brand you might check out if you live in the US. and then knit a small coaster with each of these needles and see what works for you, your body, and your knitting style. Just because someone says it helped them doesn't mean it will help you, because you might have a slightly different technique. Your body might be, or your hands might be bigger or smaller, and then ultimately this could mean, well, it doesn't work for you because these needles are all the same size. There is rarely one solution that helps everyone. And of course, you do have to consider someone might have carpal tunnel syndrome and you have tendonitis or chronic tendonitis, and then different things might work. And thirdly, when it comes to ergonomic knitting, I do believe that knitting needles maybe are the last 5% only. If you optimized everything else in your knitting routine, then you might look for the perfect knitting needles. But before, you really should, or I think you will benefit more by working on your posture, by your overall knitting technique and style. So I would be very careful to expect to fix all of your knitting problems and pains by simply buying a different needle. In my experience, and from everything I read, I received so many comments on my videos and of course on my Patreon account, and I would be very hesitant to expect your needles to fix everything. Anyway, I hope this video was helpful. Like it if you enjoyed watching. Make sure to watch all the other knitting needle reviews here on my channel. Comment if you have any further questions or suggestions. And of course, make sure to subscribe to my channel if you don't want to miss any new videos. Happy knitting and enjoy the rest of your day. Here in Vienna, as you can see, it's a beautiful sunny day, so I am gonna head outside and knit a little bit on the terrace.